Okay, folks, this is the UK house price index. Actually, the Scottish house price index, especially, we're talking about Fife properties. Does what it says in the tin. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about is the month of January. The data was out yesterday in terms of where the market is. I'm also going to talk about inflation, where it's at, and also base rates has been announced today at 4.25%, and how that will affect the housing market at the end of this. So let's go dive straight into this, and I'll show you year on year where we are in terms of the price of houses towards the end as well. So here we are here right now. The Scottish house prices average is sitting at £185,016. Now, just a wee headline here. You've got average salary in Scotland is round about the 33,000 mark. So if you take 885,016 divided by 33,000, you are well below 5.6 times average salary. 6 times average salary is a good benchmark in terms of where we are for stability in housing and in terms of the housing prices and affordability as well. I know somebody from a standing start can't obviously afford 6 times the average house price, but you are expected to get the average house in the second move or the third move and not straight away in the first move. So that's why 6 is a good benchmark. It always has been over the time and period since house prices have been collated since 1984 itself and onwards. Okay, so what is the economic statement in terms of what's going on right now? Well, average house prices in Scotland increased by 1% in the 12 months to January 2023. Now, in terms of Fife, the average house price actually increased by 1.8%, and we'll give you the average house price for Fife in a minute. So this was down from 5.1% in the 12 months to December 2022 and was slower than the average UK house price inflation of 6.3% in the 12 months to January 2023. The Scottish annual house price inflation has generally been slowing since a recent peak of 13.8% in the 12 months to April 2022. Scotland's annual inflation slowed this month because the average Scottish house prices fell in January 2023, but rose in the same period a year ago. On a non-seasonally adjusted basis, now seasonally adjusted is a statistical process that people use to remove factors that potentially will be one-offs. So they seasonally adjust the figures in order to smooth it out a bit so you don't see huge increases, huge decreases, and people panic. That's why you seasonally adjust things. It's a statistical smoothing process. So the average house price in Scotland decreased by 0.5% between December 2022 and 23 on a non-seasonally adjusted basis, compared to an increase of 3.4% during the same period 12 months ago. On a seasonally adjusted basis, average house prices in Scotland decreased by 1.3%. So see how that, on a non-seasonally adjusted, it was 0.5%. On a seasonally adjusted, it's 1.3% between December 2022 and January 2023. Now, let me just say, comparing the provisional volume estimate for November 21 with the provisional volume estimate for November 22, the volume transactions decreased. In other words, that's the number of properties actually sold in that period, in the same period in November, because this takes a wee bit longer than average house prices to collate that information on an accurate basis. So they still have to wait for a lot of numbers to come in from the solicitors when they register them, because that's how the process works. So that's why instead of January 2023, they use November 2022 as so it's a couple of months behind in terms of the volume transactions. So they decreased by 6.2% in Scotland and increased by 45.8% in the UK. Now, in terms of the volume numbers for Fife, they were, and I will cover them a wee bit later on, but basically the volume numbers were quite stable in comparison to the year before. Fife November 2021 was 640, and in November 2022 there were 603. So there's not really that much a reduction. It still means a stable market in terms of these numbers so far. We don't have December and January, and they'll come out over the next months. But still a stable market. But I do that update as well for Fife, remember, every single week on a Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And the numbers suggest there it's even Stevens. In other words, the number of properties actually being listed for sale versus the number of properties being sold for sale seem to be quite similar every single time. The health of the market is on the property market is not due to the number of not due to the price point of a property, because that's not how you can tell the health of a housing market. It's a number of transactions which is the most important key indicator there. In other words, the properties sold. For example, there's 6,500 properties sold on average every single year in Fife. If you dropped that, say, by maybe 20%, you're 6,500. I'm using my calculator here, times 0.2, you're dropping by about 1,300 properties. Now, on average, if someone refurbs their property by, say, 15 to 20,000, we'll just take 20,000 a benchmark. In other words, new kitchen, new bathroom, new heating, new decorating, new carpet, and all the rest of it. Multiply it about £20,000. It's effectively another, let me see, 26 million. That's effectively another 26 million into the economy in terms of jobs, in terms of sales for kitchen fitters, bathroom fitters, plumbers, and everything like that. So if the number of transactions drop, there's less money being spent on property overall in the Scottish economy, especially the Fife economy. Therefore, contractors suffer because they don't have as much sales. Therefore, they can't employ many more people, and they have to reduce their workforce as well. So everybody suffers. See how the transactional process is the most important point as the health indicator to the property market itself. It's the number of properties sold and not necessarily the property prices. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so let's go on to the price changes. Price changes overall. I like to talk about that one as well. I'll just pop up my wee graph. I love a graph here. So we have price changes graph here. As you can see, annual price change. It says there. You can see that right across the board. The annual price change in Scotland over the last 5 years, that is. So in Scotland, average prices increased by 1% in the 12 months to January 2023, down from an increase of 5.1% in the 12 months to December 2022. See how that price is coming down? But I've got a wee graph which shows you not to panic, because prices aren't dropping that dramatically in terms of what I say here, because it's quite easy to interpret. Wait a minute, it was 5.1% in the 12 months to December in terms of the average price, more in terms of increase, but now it's only 1%. So we've basically dropped 4% in that month. But let me show you the graph later on, and I'll show you why you shouldn't be too concerned about that. So annual price change by local authority for Scotland. Low numbers of sales transactions in some local authorities, such as Orkney Islands and Shetlands, can lead to volatility in the series. While they make efforts for accountability and affordability and volatility, the change in price in the local levels can be influenced by the type and number of properties sold in any given period. Geographics with the low number of sales transactions should be analysed with the context of the higher longer term trends and the focusing on the monthly movements. So this is the average property price in terms of where we are right now. This is actually quite interesting when we jump onto there. See how that's over the years it's gone down, and then the pandemic came along and everybody it dropped a wee bit. See how that drop happened in the pandemic in terms of the property prices. When the pandemic came along and everybody went, oh, the property market will drop by about 20%, and it went boom once it was over, and it just went up and up and up, and it started to drop, and it went back up again, and it started to drop again to a more stable market in terms of the prices. In terms of increases, I think it's just generally a realignment of property prices, because, as I said before, we're sitting at the average house price to the average salary at 5.6 times. So before that, 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, the average salary wasn't that different than it was now. It was about 30,000, 31,000 about 2 or 3 years ago before the pandemic, which was round about a 25% less, which meant the average price to average salary, if it's 1.8, let me look, if it's 185, 123, and then multiply it by 0.75 equals 138, and 138 divided by 31,000 equals 4.5 times before the pandemic, made property prices really affordable in Scotland and also in Fife itself. Hence the reason why I knew and I predicted at that time that there has to be a realignment in property prices to bring it back up to that natural price point, which is 6 times average salary. which is normally what it is the benchmark indicator for any property market in the UK. Okay, so let's pop on and we can see right across the board here. I'll give you a wee zoom in on here. You can see there we have, hopefully you can see that, Aberdeenshire, 2% difference, Angus, 3, Argyll and Bute, slight drop. City of Aberdeen, city centre in Aberdeen is still dropping 4.4% year on year. Clackmannanshire is still sitting at 12.4%. No surprise, because it's a decent enough area, but the price point is still really good for affordability, 171,000 on average. Dumfries and Galloway again coming up because their price point is actually quite affordable as well, 165. East Ayrshire's possibly got a bit to go because they're sitting at 124,000 on average. And you can see East Lothian still 5% year on year at 312,000 on average price point. There's Fife there. Average price point is 169,968. That is to be 169,868. Sorry, that's I can't really read that very well on the screen. And again 1.8%. increase itself. Any questions, folks? Just please feel free to ask. Scotland overall, 185,000 price point versus 183 the month of year on year. So you've got a 1% difference in that. Now, where does that leave us then? Let's just talk about that. Let's look at average price by a local authority in Scotland. Here we are here. This is actually quite a good indicator as well. You can see there. See, there's the average prices. Obviously the red ones show areas where it's, I wouldn't say the property prices are overheated, I would just say they're higher. Because bearing in mind that the average price in London, for example, for a property is £545,000, 230,000 seems a good deal, considering the average salary right across the UK and in Scotland and in Fife is round about 30 to 33,000. So it's very, very affordable still to stay in Scotland at that level, and also particularly Fife and the areas which are actually midpoint, which is this colour right here, which is a kind of yellow brown colour, light fawn. So you can see Fife is still very affordable. So is Dumfries and Galloway, Clackmannanshire, and also when you go into that, looks like, I think that's Angus in there in that bit, and then you've obviously got Perth, which is a big price point in terms of and then over in Edinburgh as well. So that gives you a good indication about price points by a local authority area. In January 2023, the most expensive area to purchase a property was the city of Edinburgh, with the average cost of 322,000. In contrast to the cheapest area to purchase a property was Inverclyde, average price point of 124,000. Wow. That's amazing. That's a really good price point. That's almost like a, yeah, that's almost like a flat, almost in the Fife area now. Flats, ex-local authority flats, 2 bedrooms. Well, in St Andrews, for example, are going for 250,000. In the Levenmouth area, they're going for round about 75 to 80,000 in terms of the price point. So that makes that very affordable for the Inverclyde area. A lot to do with demographics as well in terms of employment possibilities, skill levels, and average earnings in the area as well. That's what drives the property market itself. Sales volume wise, let's look at sales volumes. This is the average price change by property type over the years. Now, this is quite an interesting one here. You can see detached. See the average price for a detached property is 340,000, but see how a semi-detached drops almost to sub 200,000 price point, and then a terrace is 150 thereabouts, 156, and a flat there's 124. As I said, that's the same price as the average price in Inverclyde, the price of a flat in Scotland itself. And that's average price point in Inverclyde, which could be a 3-bedroom terrace house for all we know. So that gives you a good indication, again, overall the 1%, but by property type, it seems that detached properties are still very popular and they've still got a higher price point and differential of 3.1% over the year on year. Semi-detached 2.6%, terraced 2.3%. Okay, so let's look at the sales volumes. Let's look at sales volumes by a local authority. Quickly, I'll just talk about that right now. The amount of time between the sale of property and the registration of this information actually varies. It typically ranges from 2 weeks to 2 months, hence the reason why I talked about the sales volumes being a couple of months behind. But it can be longer. Volume figures for the most recent 2 months are not yet reliable level for reporting. So in other words, the 2 months just in January and December as well. That's why they use November, because they're more accurate for reporting. So they're not included in this broadcast. Sales volumes data also is available for property status, new build and existing properties, and funding status, cash and mortgage. And I'm going to show them in a minute. Let's show you this one for the this is actually quite interesting as well. So you can see the sales volumes, and I talked about that. See how the areas year on year and how the health of a market is all to do with the volume of the transactions. You can see how the Aberdeenshire area is actually dropped quite significantly. But then if you look at the average price point in Aberdeenshire, I'll just quickly go back to my handouts here. The average price point is 200,000. So, you know, it's a bit more than what we've got. You can see Angus as well. Angus is sitting at 177 versus 221. Argyll and Butte is outperforming, 172 sold that month compared to 155. City of Aberdeen, even Stevens, 358 versus 400. So it's still quite tolerable. City of Dundee, quite tolerable as well. And now when I talk about tolerable, what I mean is it's almost like for like. In other words, the number of properties sold and concluded this year in November compared to the November 2021 is almost similar, which actually indicates a really good, healthy market. If there's a huge drop, that's when you would look at the next month and the month after to see if that will still continue. And if it doesn't, it might actually reverse. So therefore, 1 month doesn't really make a trend, but year on year, it seems to be quite similar and over right across the board. As I said, you can see Fife there, 640 in November 2021 versus 603 in actually November 2022. 603 times 12 is round about the 7,200 number of transactions over the year. But I reckon usually typically when you work it out with the shorter months, because November's a 31 day month, if you take them into account, and also the period of time that properties go in the market and the period of time the properties get sold. So the properties that concluded in November will probably have been sold in roughly about 3 or 4, maybe 5 months before in the summertime, and they've only just concluded itself and keys handed over in November and registered on the register itself. So a lot to catch up in terms of property prices and property transaction numbers, which will begin to flow through and tell us a lot more in the coming months. So that's where we are right now with these markets. There's no great swings in some of the areas overall. Everything seems to be quite stable. Overall in Scotland, number of property transactions is 9,589 in November 21 versus 8,866. 8866 divided by 9,586 equals, you know, you're round about an 8% reduction in property transactions, which is not a huge amount and doesn't really have a huge impact, I would say, on terms of the property market, because that could change next month. Okay, let's quickly talk about as we go on, and I'll get on to graphs and that as well. Sales volumes in the last 5 years. So this is over the last 5 years. This is what I talked about, the sales volume. So you can see that there. So November 2018, you've got 10,000 properties actually sold right throughout Scotland. November 2019, you've got just almost 10,000 again. November 2020 was 12,000 because everybody panicked and started buying houses like they were going out of fashion. And then it stabilized again back to November 21 of 9,500 or 600 thereabouts. And then November 22, you've dropped about 700 properties in terms of number of transactions right across the whole of Scotland in the month, which doesn't have a huge impact. So 700 times 20,000, if you were doing that implication, that's about 14 million in income potentially for subcontractors and stuff like that in terms of fitting kitchens, bathrooms and that. But remember, it's right over the whole of Scotland, which is a huge amount of properties and a huge a huge absorption rate. If it was over Fife, there'd be a problem, obviously, because contractors would suffer because there would be less sales for them. But right across Scotland, it could be smoothed out a lot easier and actually spread over a more wider economic position. So it shouldn't affect things too much. Quite interesting here as well, property status. This is the transaction involving the creation of, this is a new register, such as things like new builds are more complex and need more time to be processed. Again, this means that they can take longer to appear on the land register. That's why we're back in November 2022. But interesting, you can see the price. Why is the price of new builds at 314,000 different to the average price of an existing resale property at 185,000? And why is the monthly change for a new build going up 6.5%, and the annual price change on a new build is 20%, as opposed to the average price change on a resold, which is a property we've got right now, is 4.3%. It's because of the number of the huge amount of specification requirements for new build properties to be built now. For a building warrant to be issued, they've got to have higher standards of build quality and higher standards of energy efficiency as well, which increases the cost dramatically, which is why new builds have gone up dramatically in the year, because obviously build standards and also salaries and wages will go up as well in that industry, so they have to charge more for the new build. And that's absorbed into that price. Hence the reason why there's a huge price differential of round about 1,500, 130,000 over and above the normal existing average resale price point. So it is actually, believe it or not, it's actually cheaper to buy a resale property. In other words, a property has been built for a lot of years that you're just buying from another person in the stages of the market. New builds are very, very expensive because of the build quality it's required in order to comply with the current standards, build regulations. This is actually quite an interesting one as well. Buyer status, first-time buyers, average price point for them in January 2023 versus formerly owner occupiers. In other words, no second homeowners, but they're buying again for the second time, third time, fourth time, or downsizing or whatever. You can see first time buyers average price point is 147,000, and owner occupiers, in other words, people that have are not first time buyers, is 225,000. Again, people that are not first time buyers generally have more equity in their homes, generally have saved up more, generally have saved more as well, hence the reason they can afford a higher price point. This is what brings me back to about the 6 times average salary, and this is why a former owner occupier can actually afford that sort of price point, because they've saved and used their existing property to move up the ladder to get the next one. And quickly as well, by local funding status. This is actually quite interesting as well, the funding status. This is the people that pay for cash, average price point for them that pay cash is 168,000 versus people that pay a mortgage is 192,000. Primarily, people that pay cash typically don't want the mortgage, hence the reason they look to be more affordable to release equity in their own home. In other words, and they don't want the burden of a mortgage. Therefore, they want to buy a property more affordable, so they don't have that burden of the mortgage. Whereas people that get a mortgage tend to be able to get cheap finance and cheap lending, so it's easy for them to buy a higher price point because they're using the bank's money to leverage their position. Hence the reason why the mortgage average price point for a person buying with a mortgage is higher than the average price point for the person buying with cash. No annual change really. The annual change seems to be like for like there. I don't think that's got a major implication on where that is as well. And that's it, guys. Let me just, the next one I want to share with you, this is actually quite an interesting one, where we are right now in terms of the price points, in terms of pricing overall in the marketplace. I did this graph earlier on. This is actually quite interesting. So this is since January 2022. This is the average price points for the Scottish, for Fife house prices. And this is for the Scottish house prices. And then this is for the UK house prices. Now, this is why I talk about this when we are in terms of house prices. So people keep saying that the property market is going to crash, it's going to go down, they're going to go down dramatically. Well, let me just show you this and show you where we are right now. If you think property prices have actually dropped dramatically, If you look at this graph and see there, so the average price point in Fife right now is 169,868. But if you track it back to where 169,868 was, it's there. It's in between July and August. So basically, the property price in Fife right now is back where it was July and August last year, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 6 months. So you're only about 6 months back in terms of the property prices in the Fife area as it stands right now. So it doesn't mean that you're away. So basically, most people who have moved in the last 6 months will not be selling their house, more than likely. On average, 50% of people stay in their house till about 6 years, and 50% after 6 years. So therefore, it's very unlikely that you're actually going to lose money if you buy a house right now, even though it's a lot less than what it was 2 or 3 months ago. And even though you maybe bought your house in October 2022 and it was 175, the average price is 169 now, you will not be due to sell that straight away. So it's like for like. I'll give you an example of that, actually. So I bought my house for 260,000. I spent 100,000 on it before I moved in to get it all up to speed because it was needing a lot of work on it. And that was before the credit crunch. So that was 360,000 all in. Now, the credit crunch came along. My house price immediately dropped to 300,000. This is 2023 right now, and I've never moved. So it's never made any difference to me whether the house price was 300,000 at the credit crunch and I'd lost 60,000, because I hadn't really lost 60,000 at all, because I've still not sold the house and realised the asset. But the house today is worth 450,000. So I put 360 in, 450,000, so there's 90,000 an uplift there. There you go. So over a period of time, regardless, irrespective and short-term thinking, in terms of prices actually dropping, it will make no difference if you stay in the house long enough. It's completely irrelevant unless you're going to use your house to borrow one. That's the only reason you would need to have the property price going up and up and up all the time. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. Your house is for living in. It's not for making money, and it's to stabilize your position on the property market. So if you want to upgrade or downgrade, you're upgrading and downgrading. In the rising market, your property's risen as well, and the other property's risen, but you're like for like in the same area. In a declining market, your property is actually declined, but the property you're going to buy is declined. So the whole point of having your home ownership of your house and being on the property ladder is to stabilise your position, so you don't need to take the gamble of sitting waiting and thinking, I'll sit and rent accommodation and I'll take the chance. I'll wait to see when the best time is to buy. I'll probably guarantee you'll never buy, or at some point in time in that whole equation, you'll actually believe that you've actually lost money because you bought at that time. And when you look back, it's the same with stocks and shares. That's exactly the same process that people do. Having your own property is to live in and for your family. It's not for making money on. It's to stabilise your position in the market. Incidentally, out on Monday, and we'll be doing a midweek show next week, I will prove to you how it's cheaper to buy a house right now still than it is actually to rent, even in this market where it is right now. And we'll talk about that next week, actually. Let me quickly talk about inflation and base rates. And where we are right now. Inflation, no doubt about it, it was a surprise to, well, it wasn't a surprise to me, to be honest, because if you've been watching my shows over the last couple of months, I actually knew inflation was never going to fall that quick. Inflation went up to 10.4%. Food inflation's up at 18%. It was predicted to be 9.9%, so there was no surprise. The Bank of England was actually going to put a base rate quarter point on. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that base rates are possibly going to go to 5% eventually. It might go a bit more as well, and inflation can't be kept under control. And it looks likely right now that inflation can't be kept under control. But should that be an effect? How should that affect the property market, and how should that affect house prices? Or I know we're talking about house prices and transactions. Okay, so even though base rates have gone up to 4.25%, let me explain to you. Now, when base rates were sitting at 3.5%, I was offered a fixed rate mortgage from a lender at 6.99% for a property investment. Today, the base rates are 4.25%, and that lender has come back to me today and offered me that mortgage now at 5.89%, 1% lower than it was when base rates were 1% lower. So in effect, I'm 2% better off today just because I was waiting. How does that make sense? Because the swap rates, because the stability of the economy and the swap rates between the banks are a lot lower, therefore they can afford to lend to you at lower rates. You'll still get 5-year fixed rate deals. This is a 5-year fixed rate deal, by the way, for property investment at 5.89%. But you'll still get fixed rate deals out there potentially. If you speak to your mortgage brokers, we can refer you if you want to mortgage brokers about how about that rate in order to fix you in, which will still make it more affordable for you to buy a house. The banks are in the business of lending money. They're not in the business of putting up interest rates so you can't afford to take mortgages from them, or they are out of business. They have to think of more creative ways and more advantageous ways for them to be able to actually lend you money and make it affordable for you to lend money. Hence to talk about things like 95%, 100% mortgages, hence to talk about things about 100-year lifetime mortgages for families to pass on to each other. Now, that's not an uncommon thing when you go abroad, having 100-year mortgages in other countries, where families actually stay in the same property and they just hand it to the next generation and they keep continuing to pay the mortgage for the next 100 years. That's a normal thing in some societies. So don't panic if that's the case. That would be my opinion. I still think the property market will be very resilient. I still think transactions will hold up quite well. The number of buyers may have reduced. Maybe the high end of the market, the top end property prices will be affected because the lending is obviously a lot higher and a lot less affordable than it was before at the higher end of the market, because obviously the mortgage rates have gone up. But even though they might go up a wee bit more to take into account risk, therefore the people at the higher end of the market might not be able to borrow as much. But the 1 to 300,000 it will still be extremely affordable and still be an extremely buoyant housing market. I still think housing supply demand will outstrip housing supply from 1 to 300,000. I think between 300,000 to 500,000, the market will still be, the number of properties available and the number of properties sold will still be about the same. From 500,000 upwards, it will still be probably a continuance of oversupply of £500,000 and upwards properties, but less people actually in demand because of the sheer price point of it. Hopefully that's given you a good insight into where we are right now in terms of the economy, in terms of the property market, in terms of where things are going. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them later on, or message me direct on this post later on, or maybe put something in the comments, or like, or share, or whatever, or tag somebody in that actually is buying a property right now or thinking about selling a property right now, so they understand what is going on in the housing market and actually get the facts rather than just opinions that you hear on the news. Okay, and that's it. And until next time, guys, I'm Jim Parker for Fife Properties TV.